Well, I make it just after 1 o'clock, and we've reached over 70 participants. So I think this is as good a time as any to start this particular webinar. Welcome. My name is Mike Foster. I'm Chief Executive of Energy Utilities Alliance, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar with the Energy Innovation Centre, looking at the hydrogen transition and how we can engage innovators and the supply chain in supporting the journey to a zero carbon gas network. Without doubt, hydrogen has been and still is the topic in the energy world that everybody is talking about. Those that don't like it say it's hype. Those that see it as part of the long-term future towards a decarbonised world, then they're heavily engaged in the conversations, and that's exactly where we need to be, in my opinion. There's been lots of talk, lots of plans, discussions around what a net zero gas network might look like. And whilst we've got major organisations such as Ofgem and the Climate Change Committee, BEIS themselves, all have a view and have had their opinions put out into the public sphere, it's fairly clear that for some of the smaller organisations in the supply chain, the people at the very heart of making this happen haven't yet been engaged properly, and hopefully this webinar can be a stepping stone to putting that right. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers, all of whom are going to be limiting themselves to a 5-minute contribution, and then what we will have is a Q&A session. So in terms of housekeeping about making this successful going forward, I'm going to suggest that by all means feel free to talk to each other using the chat function on your screen, something I suspect most of you have got used to by now. But for questions to the panelists, could I ask that you type those questions into the Q&A box, rather than me trying to look at 90 people at the moment, some of whom are raising their hands, some of them aren't. Much easier if the questions are tabled in that Q&A session. But by all means, do use that chat function to talk amongst yourselves as the webinar goes ahead. So without further ado, I'd like to move on to our first speaker. He is Mark Danter, who is the Senior Project Manager at Northern Gas Networks. Mark, the first 5 minutes of the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, as Mike said, I'm one of the Senior Project Managers for the H21 suite of projects at NGN. So I look after a number of the suite of projects we've got, both NIC and NIA funded. I originally got involved about 4.5 years ago, pulling together the initial bid for NIC phase 1. But I also chair the BEIS group looking at network safety and impacts. There's a series of groups that are in place. So on behalf of the networks, I chair that. And the role of that board is to work through the safety evidence for conversion of the gas network to hydrogen, and determine any gaps that were found in the evidence, and work up some projects to fill those gaps. Just on H21, we're currently in phase 2 of that work. So we're looking at the network operations and methods that we use to operate and maintain the network. And that's on a purpose-built microgrid up at Spade Adam, where we're looking to replicate the way that we do these operations and see if we can do them with hydrogen, as we've done previously with natural gas. We have tried to engage with the wider community in they're involved in some of these activities, and we've invited them up, or plan to invite them up to work with us on that evidence gathering. And there'll be more of that coming up in the future. And we're trying to work through the types of businesses that are involved with that. We're also tying up with NG, so they are planning to do their future grid project up on the same site. So by the end of 2022, hopefully we'll have a kind of beach to burner test facility that will be available to third parties once their testing is complete. Where again, NG are doing a similar thing where they're going out to various different suppliers and engineering companies to help with that work. The other piece of work we're doing and have done recently, we've launched the Hydrogen House up at Low Thornley, where we've got two houses that run on hydrogen appliances. So we've got two different types of boilers. We've got the cookers, hobs, and fires. So we're trying to again gain awareness and engagement throughout the community on the use of hydrogen and the acceptance of hydrogen appliances, and that's open by invitation to come up to have a look at that as well. We've been working with EIC on some projects, primarily the hydrogen detector that we use or plan to use in a domestic environment. So we've gone out with EIC to various different companies to look at developing that product, and hopefully over the next few years there's going to be more of that as we find gaps in evidence and activities. So we're still in a fairly early stage in that process. So we're keen to get others involved, both from all the GGN's point of view and grid. So yeah, we're trying to work, say, closely with EIC over the next few years to look at how we can engage with other parts of the industry that are not already engaged, as Mike's pointed out. So that was a kind of quick overview of what we've done. So thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mark. That's great. Setting the scene very nicely. Our next speaker is Chris Train, who is heading the Gas Goes Green initiative, and as many of you will know, is the former chief executive of Cadent. Chris, over to you.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Mike, for that kind introduction, and thanks to the EIC for facilitating this webinar of supporting the transition to hydrogen. Gas Goes Green is an initiative set out by the Energy Network Association along with the gas network companies, the four distribution companies, and National Grid as the transmission company. And that is to really coordinate the strategy and the story of decarbonising the gas grid here in GB in order to meet the net zero targets by 2050. And obviously a large part of that is hydrogen and the potential to convert the current gas load and the current heating load to hydrogen, which of course is a non-carbon gas. Whole suite of complexities around how you achieve the production of carbon, but I'm going to talk, the production of hydrogen, but I'm going to particularly talk around the opportunities from a network perspective. And I should also add, just in passing at this point, that Gas Goes Green includes biomethane, bio-SNG, and other green gases in meeting that challenge of decarbonising the grids. And anaerobic digestion and biomethane are particularly important because they have the opportunity to create negative carbon and therefore contribute to that net zero point. So hydrogen's been on a long journey. As Mike said, there are those that are very strong supporters and those that are very strong naysayers around hydrogen. And I think it's been quite a tough journey to get over some of the quantities and scale of the dynamics of the UK energy heating load. You know, that the fact that 85% of homes are heated by natural gas, that is a lot of energy to replace and decarbonize. We've made a lot of progress over the last 18 months, 2 years, around demonstrating that hydrogen actually is necessary in order for the government to meet its net zero targets. And what we actually need is a whole system approach. And we need to move away from this, it's either electricity, i.e. heat pumps, or it's hydrogen. In fact, we need both in order to be able to meet net zero, and we need both technologies. And we need to be able to give customers choice in that process. And sort of a testament to how far we've come, just before Christmas, Boris Johnson revealed his 10-point plan to decarbonise the economy, or the early steps to decarbonise the economy, which were then enshrined in the Energy White Paper release. And we are expecting very shortly, or imminently, as the Secretary of State says, the government's hydrogen strategy. And that will start to help us with that pathway about how hydrogen contributes to the delivery of net zero. And then alongside that, in autumn, we're also expecting heating buildings and what is the future of gas in buildings. But as I say, the reality if we're going to achieve net zero is that we need a whole system approach. So if I turn to innovation at this point, because after all, what are we trying to achieve here today in today's webinar? It is, how do we get the supply chain innovating and helping to deliver against that net zero agenda? Now, I think Rio was very helpful in those early stages of Rio 1 in setting innovation funds, some of which Mark was talking about within his presentation, that have helped to stimulate that, that deployment. And our challenge has been over this last year is to recognise that ramp up that is necessary to take us through the base development trials and to actually demonstrate that hydrogen is deployable in the home. So there's a ramp change through Rio 2 of investment that is required through the innovation pot. We have the mechanisms now agreed with the regulator. There are some outstanding issues around the price controls and some referrals to the Competition and Market Authority, but the framework principles are set there. And that's quite exciting for the networks, I think, to help to move on to those next stages of the deployment and demonstrating that the technology is viable and is viable at scale. So from a supply chain perspective, you know, what do we need? We need engagement around new products that are focused on hydrogen and green gases. We need digital solutions, and how do we maximize the opportunity that can be created through the digitalization of utility and energy data. We need technologies and innovation that allow rapid scale up in terms of our ability to deliver that hydrogen economy. And alongside that, we need innovations, as we have continuously, to deliver improvements in processes, performance, and overall efficiency and delivery. And I would congratulate the EIC in terms of engaging the innovators in the supply chain and bringing together people with problems with people with solutions. So I would encourage all of you to get engaged. How can you help the delivery of the hydrogen economy? And with that, Mike, I'll hand back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. That's a good challenge set out to colleagues who are on this webinar from the supply chain, and hopefully we can flush that out in our further contributions. Our next speaker is Peter O'Sullivan, who is Managing Director at Penspan. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thanks also to EIC and EUA for facilitating the discussion today. As you mentioned, I'm the CEO for Penspan. Penspan is an international engineering consultancy, but we've been active in the UK for over 65 years. And I would say we're particularly well known for our work in the midstream sector. So we know the gas networks very well, but also worked upstream and downstream of that. So the perspective, I guess, that we bring to this discussion is around how you connect the upstream element of the hydrogen story with the downstream element of the hydrogen story, and how do you make all of that work. I'd just start by saying that I think the natural gas, or the gas transmission system and distribution system in the UK is a huge asset in terms of the development of the hydrogen story, and a fundamental element of it going forward. You know, pipelines are the lowest cost form of transportation for hydrogen, and probably for energy in general. Transporting energy through a pipeline is about 10 to 20%, a tenth or a 20th of the cost of transporting it through power cables, and you can transport much greater volumes. So they have a very important role to play in the development of the hydrogen market, but they need to be adapted and repurposed and developed to enable that to happen. So what I wanted to talk about today on the call was a few of the challenges that I think the supply chain can help, and innovation will certainly be required to help that, to address the challenges, to repurpose the networks. Starting with some of the engineering challenges, from the point of view of energy capacity, hydrogen is about a third the capacity of natural gas, the existing fluid in the system. But it flows at a higher rate. So whilst it has a third the volumetric energy, because it flows more quickly, you can actually get about 75% the amount of energy through a pipeline with hydrogen as you can for natural gas. And generally, network operators, pipeline operators are working below the pressure constraints of the system. So that's a very workable solution. But the key engineering challenge, I guess, for hydrogen is the embrittlement that hydrogen causes in steels, and particularly high-grade steels. Lower-grade steels, it's less of an issue. So hydrogen gets into the metal matrix and reduces toughness and yield strength. And as a result of that, operators have to manage the impact by lowering operating pressures or reducing operating cycles. And if somebody was connecting an offtake to national grid to take hydrogen out of a higher pressure system with these constraints, you may need extra facilities such as pressure reduction stations and so on to make it work. So from the supply chain point of view, the innovation there is potentially around liners, coatings, potential additives to hydrogen that will mitigate against the embrittlement. The other area that will need a lot of focus and development is around compression, because for hydrogen, centrifugal compressors don't work terribly effectively. Because of their lower molecular weight, their tip speeds are higher, puts higher rotor stresses, and compression ratios across the compressors are reduced. So the whole area of compression is going to need a different approach. So that will need to be figured out. There are also, quite a few operational considerations that will need to be addressed to make it work. Obviously, the flammability of hydrogen is a key issue. The ignition energy for hydrogen is about a tenth that of natural gas. So that means that the whole way that plants and buildings are laid out for hydrogen will have to be adapted. New ATEX specifications for equipment, and so on. Ventilation requirements will need to be changed. So from an operating point of view, that will need to be addressed, as well as things like venting and blowdown of systems, where because of the ignition risk, that will need to be handled differently. There'll have to be different solutions for venting pig traps and filters and so on. And then from a skills point of view, there'll be a whole new range of skills required to manage all of these factors. So training of the operation and maintenance workforce for first responders and so on will be a big area in terms of making hydrogen work, and we'll need to have people who are competent to enable that. So there's a huge amount of work to be done, well outside of just having the technology to produce hydrogen and store it. There's all of these factors from an engineering and an operational point of view that the supply chain will have to be lined up to try and address. So from our point of view, that's where we're focused. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for people dialing in today to get involved and help progress the transition from that perspective. I'll leave it there for now. Mike, thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And I'm glad I'm not doing the guillotining. You had your own alarm clock. I could hear. Just a quick reminder: if you've got questions, please do put them in the Q&A box for the session that comes after the final speaker has finished. But we're halfway through our contributors at the moment, and our next speaker is Lorna Millington, who is the Future Networks Manager at Cadence. Good afternoon, Laura. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. So sort of linking very seamlessly into Mark's starting piece, from a networks perspective, all of the work that we're doing around hydrogen is very much a collaborative affair. We're all making sure that where we can, we're working together. Where we're doing things separately, it's all shared through our normal means of ensuring that our innovation is disseminated well. But that said, it's because this whole concept, and Peter mentioned it, it's a great big asset base. To understand how much of it can be reused for hydrogen is a big task to undertake. To then know what you can reuse, how you can reuse it, what that means for operating a system, being able to work on it, as Mark alluded to, is huge. Now, we probably started thinking, yeah, we've got this all in hand, and the group that Mark alluded to for BASE, but we've spent a lot of time making sure we've got no gaps, that we've got projects to cover all of these evidence bases. But it's a huge puzzle. It's quite an extortionate amount of things, from the large to the small. This is everything from the big infrastructure into those small components, the detectors, as Mark mentioned. We've got a whole raft of things to sort of understand. But that said, because it's a puzzle, at the moment, we're still fact-finding. We're very much in that draw evidence in, understand what we can and can't do, how it could be put together successfully, what things we can adapt, what things we really just can't continue to use. This is a 200-plus-year-old asset base that has every style known to man to understand. But as we do get that picture, we've really got to get into innovation. And at the moment, it feels a little early. We haven't quite got all the evidence known enough to be able to ask the right questions. We want to ask the right questions. There's a very big balancing act between asking too early and not getting the right answers, getting people to spend a lot of time thinking of innovation and then finding it wasn't quite what we wanted. So we're really conscious of the fact that we want to engage, but we sort of don't know quite all the right questions to ask at this point in time. But we will do. We're probably looking at the next 12 to 24 months that things will really come crystallized. We'll have a much clearer questions that we're trying to answer. We're also, as Chris alluded to, the 10-point plan set out having a village trial, a neighbourhood and village trial. We're beginning to prepare our proposals for those village trials across the networks. And that, again, may include the need for innovation for us to be able to deliver those. But as we go forward, this is balance of, things that are novel and new that may work in a hydrogen world, but actually what can we use now? Because we've got really quite a piece, a lot of money and energy goes into creating innovation. making sure it's potentially dual purpose could be one of the wins that we can really benefit from by making things methane and hydrogen capable. I know some of those things are quite a bigger challenge than just focusing on hydrogen, but those could be things that really do give us good wins. And lastly, thinking about the customer, we're coming at it from a very network perspective, but the whole gambit of being able to repurpose is making sure the customer gets a low cost, not least disruptive answer. We need to make sure that that consumer piece is there, but also it's UK residents. The less we dig up roads, the less we have to invest in making those physical changes to the network for ourselves and for the electricity network is going to be a great win if the supply chain can help us to do that. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Laura. That's great. Another challenge to the supply chain there. Our next speaker is Andy Vine, who is the commercial manager at ALH Systems Limited. Good afternoon, Andy. Over to you.
Thanks, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone, for the opportunity to talk on behalf of the supply chain. Two words that we've heard a lot of over the last few talks. So for those who don't know me, I've been involved with the EUA for several years now. As I'm sure you're aware, they work very closely with both the energy networks, the supply chain, and of course the EIC. Over the past couple of years, there's been plenty of conversations related to greening of the networks. It's an exciting journey for the UK to be on. I've no doubt we've heard talks from a range of people with a range of solutions and ideas, some more radical than others. Some good ideas on how to deliver net zero. As a gas man, born and bred, I suppose, going all electric does concern me. I'd rather be seen supporting Chris's whole system approach. However, what I've been asked to just talk to you guys about is what do I hear the most from the supply chain? How the supply chain can get involved? What do we need to do to get involved? What do we need to do to get our products hydrogen ready? A phrase we hear a lot, hydrogen ready. What does that actually mean to the networks? Working as an SME, I see firsthand updates on social media as LinkedIn, relating to large-scale projects, hearing testings going on. This is outside the daily business and BAU as we know within Rio 2. However, what we do see from the supply chain is it tends to only be a few selected suppliers at this moment. These are large suppliers, for example, PE pipe suppliers, fittings, the guys who supply lots of fittings. But what about then down to the SMEs? A lot of SMEs talk to me about how do we get involved? What do we need to do? When are we going to get our products tested? I also get some concerns, will our products actually be involved going forward? No, Lorna then just mentioned it may be too early, but it's understanding when do we need to get involved? When do we need to be engaging with the networks? So I get that an awful lot. The other one I get is a slightly thorny issue about specifications. I hear about lots of people grumbling about specifications. What do we need to be working to? As the panel know only so well, last week we got asked one simple question: can the supply chain please have some clarity when the relevant standards and safety case will be finalised to accommodate blended 100% hydrogen? What about the other parts of the networks? So these are some of the questions I get talked about and I get asked about. It's not the first time that question though has been posed. This forum may not be the time to answer it, but it's certainly something that we need to get clarified. And certainly, as you all know, suppliers want to help. See that IGEM are working on specifications, taking a lead on decarbonisation. Maybe now is the time for that more holistic collaborative view on where the team at the EUA and EIC can start linking the networks and supply chain together and hopefully working more side by side. Innovation and funding. So we've already mentioned that. We already know that during Rio 1, innovation and funding were two words that went together very well for the last 8 years. However, innovation hopefully will continue to continue as it does give the supply chain that sort of safety net around innovating and spending time and money. However, it may be one more thing for the EIC to start, maybe looking good at how can we start bringing some of these collaborative ideas and some of the funding opportunities that are out there and could be out there. Let's get them down to the SMEs and making sure there's greater awareness. If we do need some support avenues, as I say, maybe that's the way to do it. So, to summarise, and I won't keep waffling for Mike. Yes, may I ask three really simple 3 points really. Small players were not being informed or kept updated. Discussions need to involve and include the supply chain. Maybe, Mike, that's through Mike's the thought that the GDNs would probably want to look at that and how to start engaging earlier. And then, of course, the GDN plans, more openness about timings and specifications would be greatly appreciated. So, fairly brief, but that's what we hear from the SME and the supply chain sort of perspective on this. So, I'll hand you back, Mike.
Thanks very much, Andy, and it's a good response back from the SME perspective, and something for our network colleagues to think about. So thanks for that. Our final speaker from the panelists is Neil Gannon, who is Principal Engineer at Rosen. Neil, good afternoon. Over to you.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thanks, Mike, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to speak here. Introduce myself first, Neil Gannon. I am a Principal Engineer here at Rosen in Newcastle. My background is in materials and welding, and I've been with Rosen for just over 3 years. For those of you who haven't heard of us, Rosen is an integrity engineering company, asset management company, and we have got a very, very strong sort of background in history in inline inspection and inspection of pipelines. So the division that I'm in was actually previously known as McCore Engineering. So we've got a long history with the UK gas networks and trying to understand the impacts of integrity of gas transport. As Rosen, we first got involved in the hydrogen journey about 5 years ago when we did a small feasibility study for National Grid about what it would take to put 10% of hydrogen into the transmission network. I think at that time we asked a lot of the questions that Lorna and Mark have been busily trying to answer ever since. And myself, I got involved about 2 years ago and gradually started getting more and more interested, excited, and scared by just how much work there was to do and what was involved with this transition to hydrogen. I think from my personal point of view and Rosen's point of view, I want to start off by saying absolutely clearly, we are convinced that the transition to hydrogen is possible and that we are convinced that some form of transition will happen. Reason why we are sure it is possible is because there are already about 4,000 kilometers of hydrogen pipelines out there. They already exist. We know it can be done. All the work that Mark, Lorna, and colleagues are doing is proof that houses can be heated with hydrogen, that appliances can be made, that the local grid can be adapted to hydrogen. So it categorically can be done. Why it's inevitable? If you look at the amount of sort of publicity and groundswell of opinion behind it, decarbonisation is going to happen. I don't think there is any way to avoid that. And I don't even think it will come to a choice between a holistic approach and full-scale electrification. I think just because of the scale of the challenge, a holistic approach with involvement from all industries is going to be required. So I'm probably a full-scale convert to the fact it will happen. In terms of whether or not it's hype, whether it'll happen as quickly as some of the more optimistic projections happen, whether it will happen as completely as some of the more optimistic projections, that I think is the area for debate. But the fact it is going to happen is absolutely clear. From our point of view, our major interest is in the integrity of the existing infrastructure. So this is looking at the pipeline infrastructure predominantly and how that safety can be managed once the transition to hydrogen becomes underway. We know that hydrogen pipelines do work, they can work. The work that colleagues are doing is showing that we can repurpose part of the existing infrastructure and it can be demonstrated to be possible. I think our major challenge is that we also know that the infrastructure generally and the network generally is a very heterogeneous beast at the moment. As Lorna mentioned earlier, bits of it are hundreds of years old. The majority of it is 40 to 50 years old. The construction quality, the materials, the records available will vary from part to part. And to understand what the impact of hydrogen will be on that network means that we really need to understand and monitor the condition of the network, both now and in the future. The UK has got a really enviable safety record for the gas transmission distribution networks. We have not had any transmission real failures. We have a very good safety record for pipeline failures, for gas failures generally. We know that elsewhere in the world, they do get gas pipeline failures. Personally, I've been involved in 3 over the past 2 years, 2 in Southeast Asia and 1 in South America. So we know pipelines can and do fail if they are not monitored, if they're not managed, if they're not cared for appropriately. A lot of the best practice and the sort of procedures and management inspections that we do, which ensure that the gas network is safe in the UK at the moment, are based on empirical evidence, or at least partly on empirical evidence, and the fact that it has worked for natural gas. I think our real interest is how those procedures, how those sensors, how those monitoring technologies can be adapted and accounted for hydrogen. So challenge to the supply chain, help us with the inspection technologies, help us with the monitoring equipment, help us with the fundamental understanding of what is happening with hydrogen when it gets introduced into aged assets, and help us make sure that we can both understand the risks involved and control those risks. So back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neil. And I think you ended with a very good summary that the UK has got that world-leading gas network, and if we are going to see hydrogen as the future on our zero carbon journey, then utilising that network just seems eminently sensible as a way forward, embracing this holistic approach that Chris mentioned in his contribution. So we've had our 6 speakers. We're going to go to the Q&A session now. I'll look to box and cox with the questions that have been tabled so far. And to the panelists, some of them will be open for everybody. And I'll encourage you all to speak. And if something's been said already, then don't feel obliged. You have to say something just because you're on the panel. You can comfortably just wave it through, and we can move to the next question. But the first question I've got on my list, it's directed at Lorna, but Lorna, I'm sure you won't mind if anybody else wants to chip in as well. It's from Martin Sperring. Martin asks how hydrogen blended at 20%, and that's circa 6% in terms of carbon reduction, can be considered a useful stepping stone and learning process to decarbonising the gas network, given that the next step is 100% hydrogen, and that will involve potentially new infrastructure, appliances and boilers. Lorna, I know some of it while thinking, oh, I could do that as chair, but I'm not going to. I'm going to resist the temptation and go to the panelists. So Lorna, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Martin, for the question. Yeah, the question of blend versus 100% has been one that rumbled sort of as the work around 100% as being much clearer. It is very much something that we still advocate. It will help supply chain in terms of production and some of the other elements. And yes, it does also acknowledge the fact that we can't use exactly the same things between that blend and 100%. But blend is really about targeting what we can do without change, so that we can learn, introduce hydrogen to the consumer, do a lot of things that are not necessarily about having a direct match from blend straight through to 100%. So it's about using it for what it can give us, and then helping us to then grow out from there, because we've got the knowledge and some of those bits that we talked about in terms of what can you use between those 2 states and what things you really need to change, and hopefully limit some of the disruption that I spoke about earlier where we can.
So if I could just, Mike, if I could just add to that, I think, when we set off the original blending work, it was all about how can we reduce the carbon footprint without affecting the customer. So how do we get a blended mix that works within the current supply chain, within the current infrastructure, and within the home? I think as we have developed over this last year or so, the contribution of blending in the transition to converting the networks and converting to net zero has become more and more important. So it's only 6% carbon, even though it's 20% by volume, but actually it's really important in terms of driving efficiencies at the production end of the hydrogen supply chain. And it allows us to develop that transition. It builds capability in doing it. And today we're talking about innovation, and it allows that scope and time and drive for innovation in production, ultimately in storage. Bulk storage is lagging behind. Utilizing blending is a real opportunity for getting up and running and starting to create that hydrogen economy. I think it's well documented now that the most likely route is the building of the hydrogen clusters and the industrial hydrogen clusters. And in order to do that at scale and at speed and meet the profile of demand, blending gives a great opportunity. So it's one of those areas that's quite easy to dismiss. It's only 6%, but it's 6% of a very big number, and its rolling transition is absolutely enormous.
Thanks, Chris.
Just,
Peter, you wanted to
just add something just to build on what Chris was saying. I think it's kind of similar vein, but the other aspect to this is that what we're doing when we talk about the hydrogen transition is creating a whole new market for hydrogen. That doesn't exist at the moment. It's not like with renewable power where there was already a market for electricity that the wind turbines fed into. There isn't any market in the way that we're talking about for hydrogen as it exists now. And the 20% blend is an important way of starting to create that market for investors so that they can start to build a production facility and get it to the end users more quickly than if you were going straight to 100% and having to build out a 100% ready hydrogen market. So that's a really key, for me, that's a really key role that the blending strategy will play in the whole transition.
Thanks, Peter. I mean, as chair's prerogative, I would just add that symbolically as well, actually delivering some carbon reduction early in the process is actually a good signal to send about what the future can be with 100% hydrogen network, and the appliances at the downstream end can meet the 20% blend without any changes whatsoever. So the rollout of hydrogen ready boilers could carry on unimpeded, enabling the conversion at some point to the rollout from the industrial clusters that Chris mentioned. So I think there's a very practical reason for developing that supply chain, but also a symbolic one as well. Matt Thomas has asked an interesting question. I think all of you might want to have a go at your answer on this one. Matt asks, is there any collaboration happening internationally? Are we knowledge sharing and learning from other countries who are also looking at repurposing their gas networks? I don't know, Mark. Okay, Mark, can I start with you and see if you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, as distribution networks, we are collaborating. Just before we had the lockdown, some of the H21 team managed to get over to Germany to see Marco Gas, who'd done a very smaller scale version of what we built at Spade Adam. So we took some learning from them, and we're still in communication with them as well. And Stedin in the Netherlands are also doing some work with 100% hydrogen networks, and in fact we got a call with them next week. So we are doing stuff on the distribution level, and I know that obviously National Grid are doing a similar thing with the transmission operators across Europe as well. So yeah, we are doing some work. We're collaborating, and we have calls regularly with other parts of the world. So we've had calls with Australia, who have already a few months ago done a 5% blend into their part of the network over there. So and we've been sharing knowledge with them about the blending work we've been doing on high deploy. So there is work going on regarding that sharing.
Yeah, thanks. Neil, you were keen to.
Yeah, I was
contribute.
going to interject as well. There is an awful lot of work going all over the world at the moment. We've been involved with the European Pipeline Research Group, which is a consortium of a lot of the big operators and pipe suppliers, and developing roadmaps for how to convert to hydrogen. Take a couple of examples. GasUnie in the Netherlands have converted a pipeline to 100% hydrogen, and they are operating that at the moment. So obviously everybody is watching that keenly and getting the learning from there. The Dutch hydrogen strategy has just been announced by the government with, I think, €1.5 billion investment assigned to that. Snam in Italy have gone public that they are putting 30% of hydrogen into their network, and they are using it. I think their strapline is they're making pasta using hydrogen. The Germans are very keen, and there's a lot of work going on through Germany. The DVGW rules for hydrogen pipelines have just been announced, and so obviously the industry generally is working very closely together, and that there's a number of JIPs and various industry bodies which are all pulling together on this. I think one of the real themes that you get when talking to everybody is that the realization that this is such a big challenge, that everybody needs to work together and to pull together and not unnecessarily duplicate efforts, and somehow we'll get through it. Outside of Europe, then been talking to Australia, and even in the US, since November last year, there's been a real step change in the attitude of the US companies, and they are really taking this seriously and putting some serious time, money, and resource into hydrogen.
Brilliant, thanks. Any of the other panelists want to add anything?
I will just say that, I mean, collaboration has been incredibly important. I spend a lot of time talking to international companies, and it is a global phenomenon. It isn't just in the UK. However, what I would add to what has been said is we do, given the work that we have already undertaken, we do have some leadership in this area, which is why people want to talk to us. And that leadership is important for the supply chain, because that will create greater opportunities for businesses. So collaboration is hugely important, and investment in our system and in the UK will help to drive those future opportunities.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Yeah, I just add to that from our point of view. So we're active in the Middle East, we're in Europe, and we're in the Americas. But hydrogen has by far and away the most momentum in the UK and Europe at the moment. And we are part of an organization called Hydrogen Europe that would be worth anybody who's interested in the European market looking at. They're effectively an industry group that engage with the European Union in terms of their hydrogen plans, which I think they've published recently are vast. They're huge, and they're talking about building 40 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity by the end of 2030. So I think that's a good way to get a view on what's happening within the European Union and start to understand how that market's going to work and what that supply chain looks like.
Brilliant, thanks, Peter. You mentioned the momentum around hydrogen, and this might be seen as a bit of a sort of hospital pass question, but I'm going to put a couple of you on the spot with this question from Peter Franklin. Peter asks, given that there are circa 30 million households in the UK, and assuming that 100% hydrogen is viable, when might we see 10 million households having a hydrogen supply? Chris?
It's a good, dare I say, Peter, slightly cheap question. And it's probably too early to articulate when will that be? I mean, one of the challenges we have to do is the demonstration projects and the stuff that particularly, you know, Mark and Lorna have been talking around in there. What we need is a policy decision made. If we get a timely policy decision made, then we can deliver the plans against that. And so when do we get 10 million households have the opportunity? Let's say by the mid to late 2030s.
Okay.
But
Anybody
don't hold me
else?
to that.
Okay, well, no, I mean, you know, no one's going to put any money on what the book is on it, Chris, one way or the other. So you're fine on that. Any of the other panelists want to put their head above the parapet and come up with an answer? Lorna?
It's ironic because I'd actually written down probably between 2035 and 2040, dependent on hydrogen supply pickup. You know, a lot of this is going to be the age-old challenge. If you can only convert when you've got the hydrogen supply to do it. So we're going to get caught a little between those, which one leads and which one lags. So I think to be able to meet 2050, if we were to take all 23 million consumers as they are today, you sort of need to be there in that sort of 2040 marker to be anywhere near in a position to be able to do the rest. So I know there will be some ramp up, but there's only so much in the terms of the capability of the supply chain, the capability of the networks to resource. You know, there's going to be limitations, and realistically, no matter how many ways you cut the numbers, if you're not on that sort of trajectory, we're probably going to miss 2050 for a net zero. So it's sort of back calculating. I don't think you can be anywhere else.
Okay, that's a fair response, Lorna. And if I was trying to read the tea leaves of what's being drunk in Downing Street at the moment, I suspect that answer from both Chris and Lorna is probably why there was stories in the newspapers today about the so-called ban on gas boilers being pushed back from 2035 to 2040. I think that probably is more to do with the answer that Chris and Lorna gave than anything else that you could read in those tea leaves. Interesting question now from Stephen Tan from Fusion Group. Stephen asks, are there any plans for a new technical product standard or such scheme for items being used in hydrogen networks, like a H2 ready scheme for UK networks, or part of a GIS, or separately? Mark, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think it was mentioned earlier that IGEM are working on a number of their standards. So they'll kind of roll out from there. TD1, TD3. I know they're working on SR25 as well for hazardous areas as well. As part of what we've done up on Spade Adam, the pre-work, we had HSE Science Division review all 700 of the network standards and procedures. Out of those, it was obviously narrowed down to those that be affected by hydrogen. That is then being further distilled down to a number of key questions that we need to answer in terms of purging, venting, the PPE we wear, the tooling, etc. And some of that's being rolled into the master test plan up at Spade Adam. We've also running a project at the moment with Cadence, so Lauren's involved with that, looking at the assets in the network and the subcomponents, looking about the effects of hydrogen on those particular materials. So that has included looking at the GIS standards and seeing the makeup of those assets. And hopefully by the end of this year, early next year, we'll have a report out looking and identifying any that would be affected by the hydrogen, particularly in the distribution network. And I know Grid are looking at a similar thing over and above on the transmission network as well.
Okay, thanks, Mark. A number of questions coming through, so if I can skip across to next question. I've got one here from Tuan, who's strategy manager at Key Utilities. A broader question. How can contractors support the GDNs and supply chain in achieving innovation in hydrogen? Lorna, do you want to have a stab at that?
Yep, I can do. There's a number of routes, some of which are already existent, and some of the things that we're contemplating in terms of being able to make this a bit better in future. Obviously, with the current arrangements with our innovation funding, we have the Energy Innovation Centre, EIC. We have the likes of the Energy Networks Association, which are two different parts to the chain for us. EIC was very much about bringing smaller SMEs into the marketplace and helping them connect with us. We've also got the NA who look after the Smarter Networks portal for us, and also through that there is a route to put forward ideas for innovation that will be fed across to the networks. And realistically, there is approach directly. We are very much open, but we do have limitations in terms of the way that some of those funding routes can be utilised. So we do end up sometimes not being able to necessarily meet the aspirations of the supply chain because our funding mechanisms don't allow us to. So we have fed back to BEIS through a number of the routes we have about how we help do wider pieces. Ofgem very much are clear that for us, it has to be spent on the network, directly on the network. If it stretches outside of that, downstream of the emergency control valve, etc., we have to find other routes to fund. But BEIS are looking to do some work in that area as part of their work around end user. So there will be a number of other things that are not necessarily directly the GDNOs that may offer routes to develop and fund. So I think the answer is it's a bit watch this space, because we're hoping that we can use our own linkages, the work that we've done through iGEM for supplier days today, and other things that will just help to strengthen us getting our message out to help say what we need.
Thanks, Lorna. Peter, Neil, if you've got anything you want to add on this one?
It's a difficult one because I think everybody does have a role to play. It is really trying to work out where the best input from other places are. I think probably a general approach that I would say would be to recognize that pretty much everything that anybody in this industry is doing at the moment will still need to be done in the future. So whichever business you're in, if you're a contractor, you're still going to have to do the same kind of things for hydrogen as you will do for gas pipelines. But equally, you need to recognize that hydrogen is not the same as gas, and it will behave differently. The threats associated will be differently. The operational constraints will be different. So if you can continue what you're doing, but also do it differently, if that's not a contradiction in terms, then that will probably be the most useful advice I can give.
Yeah. Andy?
Yeah, just to add into that, it's the supply chain really wants to support that, and linking these type of conversations that we're having now are really quite key. Chris, you alluded earlier about policy making decisions, and then we've had comments around the GIS standards. Obviously, any change in standards are going to have an impact on all the supply chain. So the early we can all start getting that collaborative thinking and linking up the work that the EUA does with the EIC, the earlier the better. And adding to that, Lorna, it's not just funding that it is, it's just what are the problem statements. The earlier we know, not all people were going to be looking for funding. I know probably now there's a load of SMEs all probably rolling their eyes at me going, oh my God, we want that funding. It's a nice to have, but not everybody's after that funding. A lot of it is just trying to help this transition and getting the UK to that net zero. So it's certainly the earlier the collaboration, I'd suggest the better.
Okay, thank you. Conscious of time, I'm going to roll 3 questions into one, so you can all have a bite of this next cherry. Alistair would like to know whether we're going to see hydrogen manufactured more predominantly in country, as opposed to something that's exported stroke imported. At the same time, Mark, Howard is asking a question around the mix of hydrogen into natural gas and the impact around current meters that are on the market, and whether we will see different percentages of mix or blend in the regions, or is the long game, as he puts it, go to 100%? And Jonathan asked the question: do the panel agree that the introduction of hydrogen-ready boilers is a useful way of increasing customer awareness and in turn market traction? So all three rounded up into one. So enough meat for everybody to have a go. So I'll start with Chris.
Lovely, thank you very much. I'm pleased you came to me. In terms of hydrogen production, we have a great opportunity as the UK. We have an oil and gas industry. We have the opportunity to create a blue hydrogen industry, utilising the production of hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. We are leaders in offshore wind at scale. We have the opportunity around developing electrolysis. Ultimately, I'd rather see us as an exporter rather than an importer. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to kind of drive that. If we wait for importation, I think we will miss our targets. And ultimately, you will be able to import. It will be, Australia, for example. Mark mentioned discussions with Australia. Australia see themselves as a big exporter of hydrogen, and they've been signing up collaborative agreements with all sorts of nations to kind of start and kick that off. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to do it in country and to develop it. On the meters, I thought these three questions were all going to be related to each other, but on the meters, the Hy4Heat program has been working on developing 100% hydrogen meters, and we will be able to continue with the current meters in terms of the blending, but once you get to 100% hydrogen, you need some slightly different things from the meters. So the Hy4Heat program, which was funded by BEIS, has two manufacturers producing 100% hydrogen meters. The mix point, the variability, it will be variable from 0 to 20%, and then it will leap from 20% to 100%. The mix will be maximum at 20% because you don't have to do anything in the customer home or anything with the appliances. And you can't range rate boilers, so you'd be in and out changing people's boilers thereafter. So it makes a lot of sense to go from a blended maximum of 20% to 100%. Hydrogen rated boilers, in my mind, are a no-brainer in terms of it helps to facilitate transition. Give the signal to the supply chain and they will produce the product at pretty much the same price as the current product for natural gas. If we don't give the supply chain the signal, it'll be more expensive because it will take time to do it. So in my mind, it locks in an ambition and it sends the right kind of supply chain to, the right kind of signal to the supply chain to deliver efficiencies for the customer.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Mark.
Yeah, just building on what Chris said, really. The meters and the boilers that have been developed, well, and the other appliances as well for the cookers and the fires, they are being used in anger up at the house we've launched last week with the energy minister. So the meters, as Chris said, there's two manufacturers, and they are hydrogen ready meters, so they will run on natural gas, and they need just a simple reprogramming to run on hydrogen. So that's a simple swap over, and a similar thing for the boilers. The boilers are hydrogen ready, and they'll need anything from 30 minutes to an hour's swapping over to run on hydrogen. So, and they are, as I say, they're being run at the moment at the house, so you can actually see them working. So yeah, it's a good piece of work the Hy4Heat program's done.
Thank you, Mark. Lorna, anything you want to add?
It was only just to reflect on a piece of work that we did under Innovation, looking at the principle of increasing percentage blend all the way up to 100%. And we had a lot of people saying, well, just do that, it must be easier. And we actually did a piece of work with Kiwa looking at it. And realistically, you're looking at a minimum of 2 visits to a property per property to be able to make amendments to the equipment to be able to do that, maybe even 3. And realistically, if you don't time that well, then you get into some safety question marks about being able to sustain the wonderful safety record we have today. So, you know, the idea of do what you can with the equipment and then step change. Hydrogen ready boilers just means that, as Mark says, you get a quick and easy swap out. You know, this is about those sort of limits, making disruption minimized. It's got to be the best thing we could do.
Okay. Andy, Neil, Peter, anything you want to add?
I don't think I can add anything to the boiler and meter discussion, but just one thing, I guess, on the import export question, is going to be driven by economics. Ultimately, you know, the first wave of hydrogen production will most likely be blue hydrogen because it's scalable and you can produce industrial quantities of hydrogen relatively quickly. You know, electrolysis, you know, green hydrogen is still a relatively early stage technology. So in the short run, I think the UK is a fantastic position to scale up, given its, you know, its resource base. In the longer run, you know, it'll come down to, with green hydrogen, who has the cheapest power, because that's the key cost factor in producing green hydrogen. We have lots of great wind, so can we scale that up quickly enough? We'll be competing with North Africa, you know, with their solar plants and so on. So it'll come down to those economics and who gets out of the blocks the soonest, I think.
Yeah, just add to that there's already a project being talked about, run from Germany, with an offshore wind farm and electrolyzers actually offshore to generate the hydrogen and to put it onshore. I think that is a possible blueprint for the future, and the UK really should be in the prime position to take advantage of that with all of the offshore wind resources that we do have. Hydrogen is just a vector at the end of the day, that it's a way of transporting energy. It isn't the energy itself. And if the source of the energy, whether it's offshore wind, whether it's solar, whether it's carbon capture storage, the economics will sort it out. I think the UK is in a good place with our offshore infrastructure, oil and gas, and the offshore wind we have.
Brilliant, thank you. Look, I'm conscious of time, and I know the EIC want to have a couple of minutes at the end of this session. So can I just, on behalf of all of you, listen to the webinar, thank the panelists for their contributions, and thank you all for the questions that you have tabled and have been answered so far. There's a couple of questions outstanding, and I'm sure the EIC will make sure that we get an email response across to you. So I'm now handing, Liam, am I handing over to you from the EIC's perspective?
You are, that is correct. So I'm just going to share my screen very quickly. And I'm just going to spend a minute or two just telling you about the EIC, who we are and what we do. So I'm Liam Bolton. I'm the Innovation Community Lead at the EIC. And the EIC, we're a not-for-profit organisation. We've been around for just over 10 years. And we're funded by a number of the UK distribution networks across electricity and gas. We're essentially a gateway for innovation, where we bring innovators together with our partners. And as Chris mentioned earlier, essentially people with problems with people with solutions. And through our digital platform, you can submit innovation proposals of any relevant kind of technology you may have, and you can answer calls for innovation from our partners as well. So it's a great portal on there. We also provide a number of tools and resources to support innovators, such as our funding finder, which has anywhere kind of upwards of 1,500 funding opportunities at any one time, and also our interactive testing facilities map as well. It's an interactive map of testing facilities across the UK and a couple worldwide as well, which you can get access to test your innovations. The latest innovation support tool we've got at the moment, as you can see on screen, is our ultimate guide to innovating with the networks. And this is being produced with our partners to kind of give you innovators an idea of what it's like innovating with the networks. So please go ahead, register on the EIC Hub. You can do this at ukeic.com. And please as well, if you have any questions, email me, liam.bolton@ukeic.com. I've put that in the chat as well. And I'd be happy to kind of answer any questions, even if you're not submitting a proposal or anything of that nature. So in short, if you're an innovator with a relevant product or innovation, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Great. Well, Liam, thank you. As Liam said, he's there. EIC are there for you. On behalf of EUA, I thank you all for taking part in today's webinar. Enjoy the rest of the day, and hopefully at some point in the near future, we'll be seeing each other in person. So thanks very much. Take care and see you soon. Thank you.